So, a question I'm going to pretend someone asked me yesterday was, Peter, why do you say that atheism is not negative enough? Now, this is a theme that actually I kicked off my series of Paro seminars exploring, and it's very central to the work of negative theology and Paro theology. And very briefly, you can say that theism says that God exists as an affirmation, and atheism is a negation. God does not exist. What I argued in that first seminar is that there is this third position, which is not God exists or God does not exist, but God is the name of that which does not exist. God is the inexistent thing. Now, what I want to do here is just unpack what that might mean in hopefully an accessible way. And so what I want to do is think about actually something that happened during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Sometimes a paramilitary organization like the IRA would kill somebody and basically disappear them, just bury them in the woods. And what's happened is, for decades, many families have petitioned and fought to find out where the remains of their son is buried and to give them a proper funeral. And parents have done this for decades, and very gradually that has happened. So what is occurring there? Because in a way, the child is dead, and they know the child is dead. This is not parents who think that maybe their child is still alive. They know that their child is dead, but the child has not received a proper burial. And so in the words of Lacan, the child exists between two deaths, between the biological death and a symbolic death. And the role of the funeral is to bring these two deaths together, is to bring a symbolic death. So in many ways, what the funeral does is it symbolizes the actual death in a way that allows you to integrate that negativity and move on. And if you're not able to do that, the child remains in some way undead, in some way roaming the earth. And this is where ideas of ghosts come from. Now, this is beautifully explored in Alika Sapanchik's new book on the play Antigone, called Let It Rot, where she explores this space. Now, if superstition is the position that substantiates this lack, makes it into something, as I say, a ghost that wanders the earth, then scientism renders it nothing, says that this dimension of the undead is nothing at all, just some sort of poetics. In continental philosophy, this is called the real. It is not something that exists, but it insists. It is a reality. It's called the real, not because it's empirically there, but because it has real effects in the world. It bends and shapes things. It causes us to act in different ways, in irrational ways, in painful ways. It causes us suffering. To be human is to be haunted by this dimension of the real. And any form of superstition, which, to be honest, experiences the real, but then attempts to, as I say, substantiate it. But then on the other side, we have scientism, as I mentioned, which simply wants to do away with it, pretend that it is nothing. There's a scene in, I think it was Quantum of Solace, which is a very good James Bond movie, underrated, where a friend of James Bond's dies, and he throws him into a trash can, just like, oh, doesn't matter, you know. And the woman who he's with says, like, do you not want to basically pay him some respects? And James Bond says, you know, he would want it that way. But basically, James Bond doesn't need to close the space between the two deaths, but we basically do. we have to, in different ways, tarry with this real. And if you don't, it comes up in different ways. And for James Bond, the real is by being an orphan and then joining MI6 because he was an orphan, and him being this assassin as a way of avoiding a confrontation with his own broken childhood. So within psychoanalysis, The real is of central importance, and Lacan is brilliant at this, that this experience of something that does not exist but insists, maybe a relationship that is over, but you haven't been able to symbolize it, you haven't been able to put language to it, to put ritual to it, to let it go. And so even though the relationship is over, it is present. So there's a melancholy in you. It is over in reality, but it is not over in your mind, in your subjective self. And what you have to do, and what psychoanalysis does often for people who are suffering in that way, is to somehow bring the actual end of the relationship and the symbolic end together. And this is a very important work. And this is part of the work of parotheology. It's a work that we need today. And in a world that is saturated with, on the one hand, superstition, and on the other hand, scientism, we need a way to take seriously this real that haunts us, that marks us, a real that does not exist but continues to insist in our lives in various ways. I'll just say one more thing about it, and then if you want to explore more of this, we talk a lot about this stuff on my Patreon. That's how I support myself. I really appreciate all of you who support me there, and if you'd like to be part of that group, I'd love you to have a look at it. But the last thing I want to say about that is this real is not contained by language. It cannot be grasped by language, but comes into being through language. It comes into being through a type of lack, a type of gap or fragmentation within the symbolic realm that makes it substantive. And I'll just finish with one example I've used before, but it's from Zizek, where he said that he watched this movie. And the movie wasn't great. It was based on a book, but he saw in the movie something that is potentially great. He saw the potential. And so he went back to read the novel that the film was based on to see what that unrealized potential was. But when he read the novel, it was even worse than the film, right? There was even more unrealized potential. And so the two failures, the failure of the film and then the failure of the novel, pointed to a third manuscript, a manuscript that actualized the potential. Now, that manuscript didn't actually exist, but it insists. And, if you're a writer and you had that experience, it's that document that insists that might motivate you to write something, right? To try to write what was not written. So that real, which doesn't exist, arises out of some sort of failure in the symbolic system, in the social order, a failure that generates an excess. And this is a way to understand how lack and surplus are intimately intertwined in a way that, as I say, avoids the excesses of superstitious thinking, but also the flattening out that we see in so much scientific thought.